Good evening, Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the 19th World Economic Forum Summit on Africa. I'm inspired by having over 900 business, government, and civil society voices here today. You represent over 50 countries, and together we have created one of the largest multi-stakeholder gatherings ever at this Africa Summit. We now have a unique opportunity as leaders to address the immediate and long-term implications of the global crisis for Africa and to chart the roadmap forward. Africa did not necessarily create the crisis, but our leaders certainly can be part of the solution. That solution will be discussed over the course of the next 3 days and will include sessions on innovative financing for critical hard and soft infrastructure, looking at ways to bridge the skills gap between the unemployed and the requirements for skilled labor in our organizations. We need to look at collaborating better across our borders to stimulate trade and investment across the continent. And in an interconnected world, we will search for innovative solutions to address climate change and food security, which remain at the forefront of the debate. With just 1 year to go to the kickoff of the world's greatest sporting event, we look at the implications of the 2010 FIFA World Cup, not just for South Africa, but for the whole continent. I know that you will enjoy the intellectual challenge and stimulating debates over the course of the next 3 days. And when you leave on Friday, I am confident that you will have made important contributions, each one of you, to building a roadmap for Africa's future. Thank you for being here, and in particular, a special thank you to the South Africa government and to our President, President Zuma, for making this unique gathering possible. Being a South African myself, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you here in Cape Town. May we all participate in a fruitful, productive, and solution-driven meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. A cordial welcome to all of you. It's a great satisfaction to be here again. It's our 17th World Economic Forum on Africa. It all started in 1990 when we took the initiative to invite the heads of all parties to come to Geneva and to discuss the future of this country. And since that time, in many activities, we are particularly with our hearts connected to this country. The theme of this meeting this year is implications of the global crisis, economic and financial crisis on Africa. But as my colleague Catherine already mentioned, we want to be here not looking at this crisis in a passive way, but we want to be active. We want to see, in terms of implications, how we can use the crisis in terms of opportunities, in terms of bringing to full value the potential of this country and of the continent, despite the crisis. Of course, it's a special honor and pleasure for me to welcome here for this opening the President, the new President of this country, His Excellency Jacob Zuma.
Professor Klaus Schwab, World Economic Forum co-chairs and fellow panelists, His Excellency President Paul Kagame of Rwanda, His Excellency President Rupia Banda of Zambia, His Excellency Prime Minister Pakalita Mosilili of Lesotho, His Excellency Prime Minister Raila Amolo Odinga of Kenya, Honorable Deputy Prime Minister of Zimbabwe, Arthur Mutambara, ministers and deputy ministers, members of the diplomatic corps, distinguished captains of industry, distinguished participants, we wish to extend a warm welcome to all distinguished delegates to this session of the World Economic Forum on Africa. We are honored to host you and appreciate that you took time to attend this session in our country and in this beautiful city of Cape Town. Over the next few days, our continent will gain from the collective wisdom of the more than 800 economic and political leaders gathered at this forum. We are humbled by the presence of my colleagues, the heads of state and government, so soon after honoring us with their presence during the presidential inauguration on the 9th of May. We are saddened by the news of the passing on of His Excellency Omar Bongo Ondimba of Gabon. His contribution to peace in the continent is well known. We extend our deepest condolences to the family and the Gabonese people. Ladies and gentlemen, we meet during a difficult period socially and economically. The impact of the global economic downturn is being felt in every economy worldwide. While in many parts of the developed countries, scores are losing their jobs, rich governments are able to respond with stimulus packages and deploy existing social welfare systems. For most African countries that are still highly indebted and dependent on aid for their revenues, the continuation of the current crisis will mean increased starvation, poverty, and child mortality. We must cushion our people against the impact of the crisis as best as we can. But we also need to respond in the spirit of planning for a recovery. Africa has its own mechanisms of responding to the crisis, as do other regions of the world. No region will respond in the same way as others. We view the economic downturn as providing both challenges and opportunities for the continent and the developing world in general. One of the critical lessons for the world from The crisis is the need for a transformed global financial system. In addition, several recent meetings of the African Union have called for a comprehensive reform of the governance of the global financial system and the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF, and the World Bank. This will reflect the changing economic realities and challenges and provide a voice and representation for emerging and developing countries. Another point raised by the developing world constantly is protectionism. Concern has been raised by our African trade ministers at the growing protectionist measures being taken in developed countries. This includes the crowding out of credit through the huge bailout packages and adopting protectionist trade measures. African agriculture has suffered for decades from the huge subsidies provided to developed country agriculture. We all do understand that all economies become inward-looking during difficult economic times. However, we can avoid shutting out other markets. In this regard, we support African trade ministers in their call for a conclusion of the Doha Development Round based on its development mandate. In planning for the upturn, we must take the view that Africa is amongst the new engines of global growth. The continent has the opportunity to diversify markets and products, including building the requisite infrastructure and systems for intra-Africa trade as well as South-South trade. Africa is not without its own resources. Pixley Isaiah Seme, scholar and leader of the African National Congress, pointed out as early as 1906 that, and I quote, "The African is not a proletarian in the world of science and art. He has precious creations of his own, of ivory, of copper, and of gold, fine plated willow ware, and weapons of superior workmanship," unquote. Africa can build on its human resources, its young and growing population. The crisis provides an opportunity to alleviate the effects of the so-called brain drain by attracting the diaspora back home to reconstruct the continent. Many African economic immigrants have now discovered that the grass is not necessarily greener on the other side, and will hopefully come home soon to assist with planning for the recovery. The continent is also rich in natural resources, including agricultural land. We have also demonstrated our commitment to move forward through institutions that foster good governance, such as the African peer review mechanism. We also have the new Partnership for Africa's Development, NAPAD, as a vehicle for successful socio-economic development partnerships. Another key element of working for sustainable economic growth and development in Africa is building peace and stability in every corner of the continent. The formation of the African Union in 2002 created the institutional basis for a united and coherent approach to the advancement of peace, democracy, and development. The establishment of the various organs of the AU has provided further means to promote multilateral, peaceful, and sustainable solutions to crisis. African efforts continue with a view to find consolidated, lasting solutions in Zimbabwe, Darfur, Eastern DRC, Madagascar, and other parts of the continent. We urge the international community to support these African efforts materially and in other forms. Chairperson, we welcome the steps and commitments that have been taken globally already. For an example, in London, the G20 agreed to take steps to increase the voice and representation of developing countries in the functioning of these institutions. It also undertook to maintain their overseas development assistance pledges and commitments to meeting the Millennium Development Targets, to refrain from increasing financial and trade protectionism, and to conclude the Doha round. There were also major commitments to extend financial facilities for developing countries. We must carefully monitor delivery on all these commitments. Like all countries, South Africa has set in motion our own response mechanisms. A core element of our response to the crisis is the expansion of a public works program that will provide job opportunities to around 4 million people over the next 5 years. We are investing 787 billion rand in infrastructure. We are also looking at training, layoffs, finding alternatives to retrenchment, and the provision of financing facilities for industries in distress. A vital element in our efforts to mitigate the impact of the economic crisis is our social grants. At present, more than 13 million people receive social grants to alleviate poverty. Another step in our country's revitalization is the implementation of a rural development strategy. This involves the intensification of our land reform program and efforts to stimulate agricultural development to improve food security. One of our biggest infrastructure investment projects is in the 2010 FIFA Soccer World Cup. Hosting the World Cup has led to the creation of over 400,000 job opportunities. The construction industry has been invigorated while the hospitality industry is booming. We are therefore extremely pleased that we will get an opportunity tomorrow as part of the program of WEF Africa to visit the Greenpoint Stadium, one of the venues for the 2010 FIFA World Cup. This will no doubt inspire participants to return next year to join in celebrating the first ever African Soccer World Cup. I wish all participants a very successful forum, and once again, a warm welcome to South Africa, to our international guests. I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. I will now have the pleasure to introduce the co-chairs of this meeting, and I think this year we have an extraordinary panel of co-chairs. And I first would like to welcome Kofi Annan, Secretary General, as you all know, of the United Nations 1997 to 2006, and of course, for me, and for us, particularly important, a member of the Foundation Board of the World Economic Forum, but very engaged in Africa now in his functions as the chair of the Africa Progress Panel, as the chair of the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, and many other important activities. I welcome to the far left Soud Alawi, who is executive chairman of the Dubai Group, United Arab Emirates, very active also in this part of the world. To my right, an old friend, as you would say in China, of the World Economic Forum, Mr. Jianqing, who is the chairman of board of Industrial and Commercial Bank of China. He actually, if I'm not mistaken, is the biggest investor in South Africa, foreign investor in South Africa, and Africa in general with your recent acquisition. And please join me to welcome also a very remarkable woman, Mrs. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, who is the managing director of the World Bank, who has been Minister of Finance of Nigeria, just to mention some of her functions. Now, what we would like to do is to have a very interactive discussion for about half an hour and afterwards I would be pleased, Mr. President, if you would react to some of the points made during the discussion. Mr. President, you highlighted more or less 5 or 6 points in your speech. First, the gravity center in the world has changed from the north to the south, from the west to the east, and this is not yet reflected in the international organizations. Second, you expressed your concern about increased protectionism, inward-looking, I would say, more egoistic national behavior which we are witnessing around the world. You highlighted the potential of Africa in terms of all its resources. You spoke about the institutions like NEPAD. You talked about the peace efforts, and you highlighted your program for the economic crisis response and the mitigation and the revitalization of the country. I would like to ask the panelists first, how do you react? You may choose 1 or 2 of those different points the President addressed. How do you react? What would you like to add to what the President said? And maybe some advice you could already integrate into your remarks. Kofi Annan, would you like to start?
Well, no, thank you very much, Klaus. I think the President covered almost all the key issues. But I think we have to recognize today that we are facing a crisis of governance and a crisis of leadership. The crisis has shaken the confidence of people in leaders, both at corporate and the political level. And we need to find a way of getting that restored. And this is not an issue limited to any particular group. I mean, sometimes people point to bankers, but it is also us as consumers and individuals. I also believe that when it comes to Africa, and I think the President referred to it, we are not fortunate enough to have rich neighbors like China and Japan that Asia has to be able to release resources to stimulate the regional economy, the African economy. And therefore, as the international community pushes ahead with their bailouts and economic stimulus, they should try and make Africa part of the solution by seeking to invest in the real economy of Africa, infrastructure, that is roads, ports, rails, energy, agriculture. Obviously, we should not forget education and health. But if we were to invest in these areas, not only would it create jobs in Africa, but it would also help expand the global economy and increase trade, both within and without Africa. I also believe that I support the President's idea that as we reform the global institutions that we use to manage or govern our world, there should be a place for Africa and a place for the poor. This is not always easy, and I'm speaking as someone who tried desperately for several years to help reform the UN Security Council. And so the reform of these institutions are going to be difficult, but they are essential. I think we've recognized it and made a start. It was significant that the meeting in London in April was not a meeting of G8, but a meeting of G20. It was a recognition that the world has changed, and we have to change along with it. But the creation of the G20 I see as an interim step, because the G20, yes, came together as big economies, they have influence, but in legal, universal terms, they have no legitimacy. We have to go the next step and reform IMF, the World Bank, and the institutions, and eventually the Security Council, to really ensure that we have institutions which are universal, which are democratic, which are representative, and therefore we gain in greater legitimacy. If we are going to reform the financial institutions, and I see my sister Ngozi here with us, the countries that today sit on the boards and have bigger voice in the decisions that are taken will have to reflect and decide how much power they are prepared to give up to make the participation of the new emerging nations and the poor countries meaningful. This is difficult because, you know, I've noticed through my experience that there are two things that people resist to give up if they have it. One is subsidies. It's very difficult to take away subsidies. The second one is privileges. But here, those with privileges will have to take a decision, because if we can reform these institutions and make them universal and fair, I think the emerging nations will cooperate more easily. We have to do that to get cooperation, otherwise we may be heading towards possibly destructive competition. I believe in London, perhaps the most comfortable country at the table was China. A big economy with its economy growing, sitting on lots of reserves, everybody looking at it to put money into IMF and the institutions, and sitting at the table probably asking, what's in it for me? What are you going to do for me? How do we reform these institutions? And I think we should be prepared to do that. And of course, recently we've talked a lot about Adam Smith, and most people think of his Wealth of Nations. But he also wrote 250 years ago the theory of moral sentiments. In that, he urged prudence, fairness, equity, public spiritedness, and to those values I would add solidarity and democratic accountability. And I hope as we reform our systems and build a new system, we will not ignore the needs of the poor. Because if we do, whatever system we set up will not last for long. Thank you.
Thank you, Kofi. Now, let's look at the international institutions. Let's look at the World Bank. Ngozi.
Well, thank you very much. Indeed, all the main themes that we're struggling with today in this global environment have been put on the table by His Excellency the President and commented on by the Secretary General. The former Secretary General. You will ever remain imprinted in our minds, Secretary General. I just want to pick up maybe on a couple of points. First, on the crisis, and then perhaps on the issue of global governance. I think in this crisis, I think the key issue we need to be remembering and thinking about, as Trevor Mano said in an earlier panel, is that people are at the center of this crisis. Africa has been impacted by a crisis it didn't start, and by our estimates, 53 million more people have fallen into poverty, of which 6 million on the continent. And when we talk about that issue here on the continent, we're not talking in the abstract. It really means the difference between children going to school, the difference between people having a job, and the difference between people who may be sick, not being able to get well because they don't have the resources to get the adequate health care as a result of the impact of this crisis. So this is real here on this continent. And so the key issue is, whilst we focus on how to respond to the crisis in the short term, how can we also use these responses now as an opportunity to position ourselves on the continent for the longer-term development? How can the crisis be turned into an opportunity? As Hillary Clinton said, don't waste a good crisis. And I think that the energy here in this forum is to try to come to solutions on what do we do concretely in agriculture, which seems to be emerging as a center of interest. What do we do with infrastructure and a stimulus around infrastructure, as South Africa is doing? How do we use these to create jobs, to make sure that people can put food on the table and maybe even feed their neighbors? I think these are the key issues that we need to focus on and come to grips with. We also need to move from there to thinking about the shape of the continent post-crisis. We haven't talked enough about that. We are focusing on the immediate, but I think that many parts of the world are already thinking, what will be the shape of this global economy post-crisis? Are China and the US going to go back to the status quo ante? Are they going to continue their development in the way they did before? Or are they going to move and change the paradigm with which they have been developing their economies? And if that happens, what of Africa? What should we be thinking about post-crisis? How do we work issues of longer-term impact, like climate change, into the way that we look at our development now and begin to tap the resources and the assistance and our own self-help that can help us cope with such problems? So I think this whole set of issues of crisis, short-term, longer-term, but even post-crisis, the model of development that we follow is critical. We mustn't be caught short. We should start thinking of these issues now on the continent. So I think that's very important. The second set of comments has to do with the issue of global governance. And again, this has been discussed in several sessions here. I totally agree that the shape of global governance at the moment falls far short of serving the needs of particularly the low-income countries, be it the shape of governance at the Bretton Woods institutions or the G20 or G8. The various configurations, I don't think, have quite got it right. And we were talking earlier of a scorecard. If I were to give a scorecard to the shape of global governance now, as far as it impacts Africa and the inclusion of Africa, it would probably be a B- or less. So how do we then work on the institutions of which we're a part? We at the World Bank, especially the new president, Bob Zoellick, are very cognizant of the need to change the way that the World Bank's board and the way that countries, low-income countries, are represented very dramatically to improve the voice of these countries. I'm afraid, though, that we'll end up with changes that reflect more emerging market concerns than low-income countries. And that's really the concern that I have. You can see that at the G20 and what happened during the G20 meetings. There were more emerging markets at the table. And what we came out of in the last G20 was additional resources of up to $1 trillion, mostly for the emerging markets, and very little, perhaps 50 billion or so out of this big sum for the low-income countries. You know, what you get reflects, or where you sit reflects where you stand, or vice versa. If you're not seated around the table where decisions are being made, your needs and concerns are not likely to be reflected. So we need to absolutely push in the direction of getting the voice of our countries on the table. And finally, that voice also means that some of the issues of concern to us, as we spoke of earlier, such as the fact that a large number of our assets from this continent are sitting in other countries. We had a case, the case at the G20 where we had a paragraph on tax havens. The countries around the table, particularly the developed ones, were very concerned about the issue of tax havens and making sure that their citizens' taxes were paid and not hidden in the countries or in other countries close by. But the issue of the stolen assets of developing countries that was also part of that conversation was removed from the communique at the last minute because we were not there. And I think we need to fight to make sure that these issues are introduced so that we can also have a global system in which our needs, our concerns as low-income countries are reflected.
This was a passionate voice. By the way, it's interesting that the co-chairs here, we have no American, we have no European. We reflect in some way, except myself, but I'm not a co-chair here. It reflects in some ways the new world, and of course a very important player in the new world is China. Mr. Jiang, how do you react to the speech of the president from your perspective?
刚才这个祖马总统这个非常的全面和精辟了分析了，就是当前南非和非洲所面临的挑战和机遇。我想非洲这次受到这次金融危机的挑战是非常的明显的，因为尽管非洲没有在金融业方面没有犯错误，没有购买很多的有毒的资产，金融监管也是完善的，但是他们也受到了非常巨大的影响，包括外部需求的减少，包括这个外来的资金和直接投资的减少，也包括由于全球的这个原材料能源的价格的下跌，这些都给非洲经济带来了巨大的这个挑战。刚才总统先生已经非常详细的做了这个描述，但是我从总统先生的讲话中听到了一种声音，就是信心。我想非常重要的是信心。那么当前这个非洲所遇到的这种危机，从中国话来看，危机两个字，就是危险和机遇所构成的。那么应该说，这个非洲从长远看，应该面临许多的机遇。刚才总统都讲到了，这次金融危机以后，这个全球的经济、金融应该变得更加的均衡。包括在储蓄与消费的关系，包括利用外部的需求和内部的需求的关系，包括这个发展和公平的关系，也包括这个在金融方面这个国际货币体系的进一步的改革方面。我想还有一个非常重要的，在经济的发展中间，发达国家和发展中国家，也会他们的在全球经济中间所占的比重来看，也会更加的均衡。我想这就是这次金融危机所带来的一个非常深刻的影响。当然，从当前来看，非洲经济要渡过难关，确实需要更多的外来的资金，需要全球各个经济体，也包括各个企业，对非洲更多的关注和支持。工商银行呢，我们在2007年投资了非洲最大的银行南非标准银行20%的股权，363亿兰特。那么我觉得更重要的是，通过这一次的投资，我们之间呢，建立了一座亚洲和非洲。中国和南非之间的一座合作的一种桥梁，也通过这种合作，我们进一步对在非洲的65个项目，正在跟踪，有些已经出了成果。比如几天以后，我讲到博茨瓦纳，我们对博茨瓦纳有一个贷款、一个电站的一个项目，16亿美元，帮助他们建设一个电站。当然，其中一半的融资是由我们来和南非银行、标准银行共同来解决的。我想呢，这就是非洲将来会越来越多的得到来自亚洲的更多的资金。 那么另外一个方面呢，我想讲的呢，应该引起重视的就是，实际上非洲还具有很多的优势。我想讲一个小小的一个故事。最近呢，工商银行、ICBC 和南非标准银行，我们讲共同的支持一家南非的一家企业和中国的一家能源企业的合作。这家能源企业呢，为了更好的保护环境，它要把煤炭，这家中国的这个能源企业，它把煤炭要把它转化成气体来运用。那么这样的一种转化的过程，这个项目要有几十亿美金之多，而这样的一个提供这种技术的公司是一家南非的公司。这个南非在石油转化，这个煤炭转化成石油和天然气的这方面的技术，在世界上是最好的。所以我想呢，其实非洲同样具有非常多的优势，比如说在矿业方面、矿产业方面，在农业方面，在海洋产业方面等等，我不一一例举了。我想将来亚洲和非洲的合作，中国和非洲的合作是双赢的。谢谢。
Soud, how is it seen from the Middle East?
Thank you. Well, I must say that the president what he has gone through. It was very comprehensive, and it touched all very important elements with respect to what is the climatic finance market conditions at the moment. I think our view is the financial crisis and the credit crunch will affect most of the region's countries and business. And I think Africa would also be affected by this crisis. And it's definitely not insulated. But on the other hand, the good news is that Africa has experienced in the last 10 years a tremendous economic development and growth in terms of GDP, almost above 6%. And we think that despite the crisis, that Africa would be able to post at least a positive GDP in the next 1 or 2 years. Having said that, I think the most important thing is that from investors like ourselves, what we would like to see Africa is really the ability for Africa to create a business environment, a business environment that is good for business, good for governance, good for their citizens, as well as good for investors. I think this is something that is very important if any nation or country wants to develop itself further. In this new world, debt is not going to be available. So how does one finance growth? I think the only way you can actually finance growth is through equity. And there are today in the world, there are two pools, or I would say sources of capital that have access and are looking for investments. That is, I think, China and as well as the GCC countries. The GCC countries still have almost $2 trillion of access liquidity. And I think that Africa can use the opportunity to create and foster new partnership, new relationship with the Middle East. I think the Gulf countries have invested heavily in Africa in the last maybe 5 to 6 years, from telecommunication to industrial and also a little bit of financial sector. And I think that there could be much more to be done with respect to attract foreign direct investment coming from the Gulf countries into Africa. I think also when we look at Africa, there is also a perception. There is a high perception of that, or misconception of risk. Most of the investors look at Africa as a high risk area to invest. But in reality, if you were to look at the risks that we have experienced in the last 1 year in the Western world, I wonder which one is which continent is high risk or not. So my message to Africa and to my colleagues, I think that Africa needs to do is to develop its own homegrown strategy. It needs to create a business environment that is conducive for business. It needs to have less plans, but more execution. I think this is very important. And I think that with the young population, with such high rich mineral resources, with a vast country like Africa, Africa can position itself to become a very good, attractive in terms of investment destinations. And we as investors, we are going to look for investment further in Africa, and we hope that we'll be able to work much closely with our colleagues to develop this nation into what is to its potential. Thank you.
Thank you. We talk a lot about the crisis, but I would like to use this opportunity to ask you, as a finance specialist. There's a lot of discussion, are we in a V-shaped, U-shaped, L-shaped, or W-shaped crisis, whereby the L-shaped crisis means we are down and we will never recover. The V-shaped crisis means we bounce down and we will bounce, and we are in the process of bouncing up again. The U-shaped crisis means we came down, we have reached the bottom, but it will take quite some time until we come out. And the W means we bounce down, we are now recovering, but we will go down again, and it will quite take some time to work out from this crisis. Now, what is your opinion? What is your opinion from your perspective?
I think it would be a foolish person who would respond to that. But let me say why. You know, there's so much uncertainty in the environment that people have forecast before that they thought we reached bottom and there were green shoots that were beginning to show. And then, you know, we looked and the green shoots were really not there because unemployment figures came up and we saw we had an unemployment crisis globally. And then, you know, we looked at various other indicators for retail, wholesale trade, and nothing seemed to be going in the right direction quite the way we wanted. Because what is happening is that the crisis has gone from the financial sector into the real sector, and then is feeding from the real sector back into the financial sector. So it's not clear. You know, so I think if I were to hazard what type of shape of recovery, I could turn around and find that what I'm saying is not right. But of all the shapes you mentioned, I'll just say that it looks to me the one that may come a bit close to that may be the U-shaped. We're going to have a long time maybe going along, you know, at the bottom and then, you know, begin the slow climb up. So that's as far as I can go, but any forecast now is fraught with uncertainty. I have to say that.
Ngozi, there was a book written, The Wisdom of the Crowds. Now let's see the wisdom of the crowd, and let's see what you feel. It's just intuitively. And please raise your hand. I will ask you 4 questions. Who feels it's a V? Down, up, fast. Please raise your hand. Aha, we have some optimists here, you see? Yeah, excellent. Who feels it's a U?
Oh dear.
Yeah. Who feels it's an L? Some pessimists. Aha. Authoritative voices. And who feels it's a W? I would say W and U are probably the most foreseeable.
I think the U won.
So you won. Okay. But let's come back to the speech of the president. And I would like to ask you, Kofi, there's one issue the President touched upon. It's the peace efforts in the regions, and we all know you have been so much involved. How do you see the situation today? Are you worried, particularly that let's say, as a consequence of the crisis, and with social unrest, regional conflicts may even occur more in the future than in the past?
Let me start by saying that generally, we have resolved quite a lot of conflicts in the last decade. Many conflicts have been resolved from Angola to Liberia to Sierra Leone to Burundi, and so we should not forget that there has been some progress. Yes, therefore Somalia and others hawk the headlines, but there is also good news and progress. But I think the President is right to be concerned about the impact of the economic crisis on social stability. After all, there is economic crisis to conflict. It was not a year ago that we saw demonstrations and riots in about 40 countries because of increased food crisis. And if this were to continue, it could lead to tensions and political crisis in some countries, and government will be under pressure to provide for its people at a time when their revenues have been considerably reduced. And so the risk and the tensions are there. And this is why I would urge our foreign partners not to cut back on development assistance because of this crisis. I know the tendency will be we have problems at home. Why should we be focusing on the outside? But it will not be in anyone's interest. Africa, of course, will suffer, but the world would also pay a price. So we have to find a way of providing the support that is necessary. But since I have the floor, if I may comment on a question that Ngozi raised about post-crisis, what do we do? And I think everyone, every country and every region has to make adjustments. I do not think the US and the American people would want to continue the model that got them into the crisis, spend and import. You know, that model without saving can continue. China cannot continue its model of export and save. That wouldn't be sustainable either. And I think our guest here indicated that they are already encouraging domestic consumption. And so you see the shift taking place already. And I think when it comes to Africa, we should really begin seriously pushing green development, looking for green energy, renewable sources of energy, to avoid the mistakes that the other countries made in their development. And here we will need partnership and support from our foreign partners in terms of technology transfer and resources. And we should also really focus on investments in agriculture. Many Africans are employed in this sector, and we can not only be able to feed ourselves, we should be able to export to the world at a time when the world is going to need more food to be able to feed the growing population. And perhaps we should also begin to take population control more seriously. There was a period when we heard a lot about population and the need to control it. I don't hear enough about it these days in Africa. And in terms of our own economic development, I think we should desist from constantly exporting raw materials. We should try and process some of it, get training to get our people to work. And I think Botswana is a good example where it's handling some of its diamonds internally. And I hope the comment that our Chinese friend made about agriculture and fisheries is also something that we're going to take seriously. But Africa also cannot continue business as usual. Thank you.
Mr. Jiang. You are a banker, and a global recovery will also depend on a stable global monetary system. Now, there has been a lot of discussion in this respect, particularly about the relationship between the euro currencies, yuan, and the US dollar. As a banker, do you feel we will have an era of more stable currency relations, or are you worried about it?
这一场的金融危机之后，我们有太多的问题要解决，但是现在最重要的是当前要度过这场经济的衰退。刚才大家也谈到这个各种图形，到底 W 型啊、U 型、L 型啊或者 V 型啊，我想其实这个图形是决定于我们的政府、各个国家的政府、各个企业，他们是不是在正确的时间做正确的事情。那么我想最后的一个全球经济的这么个图形，是由一个大多数的国家和企业的图形所决定的，这也就是存在着一个不确定性的地方。至于金融改革，我们所需要反思的方面是太多了，这里面有金融发展的模式的问题，一个过度的依赖消费。一个不重视储蓄，那么一个大量的过度的利用外部的一个金融的能力，来维持自己的这种过度消费的这种金融模式，未来是不可持续的。那么此外呢，我想呢，金融监管要进一步加强，特别是要加强全球的金融监管。至于这个国际的货币的体系的改革的问题，这个最近一段时间已经引起了各方面的太多的关注。我想也是未来的方向是一定是要朝一个更加的多元的一种全球的货币体系方面的改革的。但是呢，这一些所有的讨论，我觉得现在是一个刚刚开始的阶段，要完成。比如说像货币体制改革的这一个进程，是一个很长的时间。让我们现在还是更重要的是关注怎么能够度过当前我们所面对的一个经济危机和金融危机。
Soud, you were very confident as a business leader and what business leaders can do. And the World Economic Forum believes very much in a multi-stakeholder approach. Now, there are certain heads of governments who said governments are back. Now, who should take the lead role? Business or governments? In order to get out of the crisis.
Yeah, I know. It's interesting because we come from monarchy, you know, so... The
monarchy is always...
Yeah. No, on a serious note, I think that these crises are not going to be solved only by pure government intervention and government stimulus package and so on. I think they require both the governments and as well as corporations. And in particularly, I think also the banking industry. The banking industry needs to be reformed in a way that we need to eradicate some of the speculative behavior that has taken place in the last 10 years. And I think that the impetus is really on on government in terms of providing a proper, comprehensive regulatory framework. I mean, now if you see at the G20, there is a lot of effort to try to see how, together with the Financial Stability Forum, which is now the Financial Committee, they're trying to come up with ideas as to how to address the regulatory issues, and with the help of WEF as well. So this is, I think, one area is to have a global regulatory framework that is more of a coordination, cooperation, and this will help the world to come out of this crisis. I think the government, they need to allow the banking system to get back to its knees, I mean, to get back to the system of lending and to provide confidence. I think this is very, very critical for us to come out of this crisis. Banks need to go back to lending, need to go back to pure banking, which is a commercial banking, retail banking, and I think we need to distinguish very, very much in terms of commercial banking and investment banking. Having said that, I think that every region and every country would have a different approach, and because the circumstances are very, very different, not everybody is suffering the same way. As you can see, some of the Asian countries have still a lot of current surpluses, a lot of fiscal balances that are positive, while most of other countries are in consumer-oriented countries that are in deficit. So in my view, I still think that both these crises are very, very structural. They are not just cyclical, they are structural, and it will require both governments as well as business leaders to really work together to get ourselves out of this mess that we've created. And I mean us, meaning because I'm also part of the financial system, so we also take blame for the crisis that we've created. Thank you. Anybody else to comment? Yes, please.
I just want to pick up on this issue very quickly that His Excellency Kofi Annan raised on my previous point of post-crisis, and link it to the investment by China. I think that since China and the Gulf have expressed great interest in Africa as an investment destination, we really need to seize on this and think, what type of investment are we looking for? Are we crafting our plans so that we can attract them to the investments we want? Or are we just waiting as Africans for them to come and say we want to invest in this or that or the other? I think we must take that leadership in the post-crisis world. And one of the reasons I'm saying this is that China may be moving up the value chain in terms of its production. And as it moves up the value chain, you know, somebody should be occupying the vacuum to produce those things that China no longer does. And there's no reason why China is said to be the factory of the world. There's no reason why some of that factory can't be outsourced here on the continent to create jobs for us. There is absolutely no reason why what I'm wearing now should be manufactured in China. This is our cloth, our intellectual property, yet at the moment we see a phenomenon where this cloth is being made in China, re-exported back, and sold at a cheaper rate because it's less expensive. If we can persuade China to invest here, to make this here, so we can employ Africans, those who wear the cloth to make the cloth, that's just one example of some of the things we can do.
Mr. Jiang, how do you react to this proposal? Great opportunity for you to finance those operations.
我觉得现在需要做的，实际上是要更多的宣传非洲。让更多的中国的公司来了解非洲，我觉得这是一件我们要继续加强的一件工作。真的坦率地说，有许多的这个中国的公司，他认为非洲还是一个非常遥远的一个大陆。那么当然现在是越来越多的他们中间的一些先行者开始进入到非洲了。 那么，我想未来中国对非洲的投资是会越来越多元化，它的行业分布会越来越广。我认为会有相当多的这个中国的制造业，将来到非洲来寻求发展。我也觉得非洲有很多好的一些技术， 有些很多企业有一些好的技术，我觉得也应该到中国去寻求发展。就像我刚才介绍的，南非的这个把煤炭变成石油、天然气的这样最好的技术的公司，它就寻找到中国去发展。我想呢，这未来会成为一种趋势。所以呢，我再一次呼吁，多宣传非洲。
Your Excellency, President Zuma, would you conclude our discussion and add your own point of view?
Well, thank you, Chair. I would imagine that generally, if I listened, I think the points are gravitating towards the same direction. I think we all recognize the fact that the crisis has affected all of us. Perhaps this time the world is talking not only with one part of the world feeling the impact. I think all of us is one issue that has brought the kind of interest to everybody to discuss and find a solution. And I think there seems to be an agreement that it provides a lot of lessons and that we must take lessons. And I also think that there's an agreement that regions will react differently, but the circumstances are not necessarily the same, although we are affected by the same crisis. I think quite a number of points have been made with regard to Africa, what Africa should do. Otherwise, this is a challenge, but Africa also must take advantage of it and position itself to address this crisis in a manner that will make Africa, at the end, and I don't know after which letter, whether it's W or it's U, but Africa should be in a position where it is able to handle the matters differently. I think one of the points that has been stressed has been that we should be ready to do things in a different way, not the old way, so that we are ready to meet the challenges and also not to repeat the same kind of mistake. We cannot get into the same kind of a problem on something that we could have avoided. I think the issue that is very strong, that I think almost everyone agrees, is the issue of the reforming the global institutions. I think is a very strong point. This, I think, crisis, in a way, backs that argument a great deal. And I think it's just a moment that we should, all of us, accept that reality. And therefore, back to your point, Professor, that the world has changed. And if the world has changed, we all need to recognize that the world has changed, and therefore we must do things differently. I think those are the points that have been made a great deal. Of course, the issue about Africa, I think, has loomed very largely in the comments about what Africa ought to do. And I think that's a challenge to Africa. I'm sure my colleagues sitting here would have taken notes on what Africa should be doing. But one of the critical issues, of course, is in relation to Africa, is the question of conflicts that need to be addressed very decisively. Because if you have conflict, even if there was no economic crisis or financial crisis, it just creates problems to the regions and countries. It becomes worse when you have such a situation. I think this may be an opportunity for the African countries as well to pay more attention on this issue. In other words, if there are conflicts, African countries who must be able to move decisively and deal with those issues, particularly because if there are conflicts in some country, the neighbors get affected in one form or the other. And therefore, it's not just an issue within one country as well. I'd raise the issue that we are making some efforts to address those matters in a sense that we were hoping we will succeed. But critically, I think, is the problem of the developing world, who get affected in one way or the other. I mean, this crisis did not originate from the developing world. It originated from the developed world. I'm sure if it emerged from the developing world, there would be different arguments about how much the developing world is failing to do things, how much they are not organized, how much they are not following the rules and regulations, etc. I'm sure there will be a lot of such argument. But I think this indicates that all of us ought to do something so that we can bring a balance in the manner in which we handle the economy worldwide as well as the financial transactions. So I hope that this forum this time could spend more time on these issues and help us to develop new ideas so that we are able, thinking together with the world, to address the problems that face the continent. But I think the discussion has been very much interesting, and I think your introduction of the letters was quite something. And you could see the different views here. And I agree with my good sister that the U is 1, the W was number 2. Yeah. Very small minority of the other letters. But I'm sure they also have something to say. But thank you very much for the opportunity, indeed.
Thank you, President. We spoke about crisis, and I think we all agreed that this crisis is of transformational nature. We need innovation. We need innovation everywhere. But we need innovation not only on the macro level. We need innovation on the micro level. We have to make sure that we address the issues not only from a political perspective, but also from a grassroots perspective. And in this respect, I would like to ask you to stay for some moments, and I would like to ask the chair of the Schwab Foundation for Social Entrepreneurship, Hilde Schwab, to join us for a moment.
Mr. President, Presidents, Excellencies, dear friends. From our esteemed guests in this opening plenary, we have just heard about the global trends affecting Africa and how Africa can be part of the solution to the actual crisis. And the next few minutes are about those individuals who are addressing some of the most challenging issues, and Klaus took it from my mouth, on the micro level. The social entrepreneurs. They pursue poverty alleviation and environmental goals with entrepreneurial spirit, business methods, and the courage to innovate and overcome traditional practices. Social entrepreneurship is about applying practical, novel, and sustainable approaches to benefit society in general. We deeply believe that economic as well as social progress can best be achieved through entrepreneurship and innovation. The World Economic Forum's and my husband's motto for over 30 years has been entrepreneurship in the global public interest. This means that business ultimately has to serve society. During the last decade, we have encountered many social entrepreneurs whose main or sole motivation is to create social change and to work directly to improve the fate of millions of people who otherwise would be excluded from society and the benefits of economic development. To promote these people and their new models of sustainable social change, Klaus Schwab and I have created the Schwab Foundation for Social Entrepreneurship, which in cooperation with media and other partners selects the best examples of social entrepreneurs around the world. I am now today particularly pleased to welcome one of our first Foundation Board members, Mrs. Zanele Mbeki, former First Lady of South Africa. It is my pleasure now to present to you the 3 winners of our Regional Social Entrepreneur Award for Africa in 2009. Dr. Mitchell Besser and Jean Falk, founders of Mothers to Mothers, who are active in Kenya, Lesotho, Malawi, Rwanda, South Africa, Swaziland, and Zambia. Jean Falk, please. Mothers to Mothers is a multinational, non-profit organization providing education and psychosocial support to pregnant women and mothers living with HIV in conjunction with medical services. It is dedicated to preventing the transmission of HIV from mothers to children, the empowerment of women, and the reduction of the stigma associated with HIV. Its Mentor Mothers program hires and trains new mothers living with HIV to inspire, mentor, and counsel pregnant women newly diagnosed with the virus. In only 7 years, it had grown from a tiny grassroots organization to a multinational NGO that operates in almost 500 sites in 7 African countries, serving more than 180,000 women. Congratulations.
Thank you so much.
David Kuria, the founder of EcoTact in Kenya. After years of serving as a city planner and with non-profit organizations delivering basic services to the people of Kibera, the largest informal settlement in Africa, David Kuria has created EcoTact as a social enterprise, spearheading community service and environmental interventions with a business perspective. EcoTact has built eco-toilet malls in places where municipalities cannot keep up with the rapid pace of urbanization. Their high-profile social marketing campaigns raise awareness for hygiene and water conservation. The malls have become popular meeting places that provide ecologically sensitive sanitation together with other small business services. With 14 functioning facilities that already serve 30,000 daily users, EcoTact is currently constructing another 20 malls in 8 different municipalities across Kenya. Congratulations. Patrick Scofield, the founder of the Streetwires Artists Collective in South Africa. Patrick Scofield has revolutionized and formalized the informal wire and bead market, not only growing the social business of streetwires and its craftsmen and women, but lifting the status of these crafts into art forms, thus providing true aesthetic and economic value. With innovative systems of craft development, cooperative manufacturing, and distribution to local and international markets, Streetwires ensures the producers a fair price for their art, making it the first fair trade craft organization in South Africa. With government-certified training programs, its wire artists and students who are trained in outreach projects empower individuals with the qualifications and skills to create their own enterprises in the industry. We will have the pleasure to visit the studio artists tomorrow morning here in Cape Town. Patrick Scofield has already been distinguished last year at the Social Entrepreneur of the Year Award of South Africa by our partner Ernst & Young. Congratulations to you all, and may I ask you for a group photo?
Come here. Yeah. Yeah. Congratulations to the winners. And I think this opening session sets a tone for our discussions over the next 48 hours. I would like to thank the co-chairs. I would like to thank you, particularly President Zuma. I would like to thank all you here in the room, because you will be challenged, you will have to be active in the next days. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Excellency.